Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another session of LinkedIn Live from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. I'm David Ridley. I'm a health economist at Fuqua. Today I'll talk about how to encourage product development for neglected diseases. My talk is short, so we'll have time for your questions and comments. Please leave those in the chat. Let's go to my slides. The market doesn't provide sufficient incentives for neglected diseases. These are diseases that tend to be found in lower income countries. Often they're carried by pests like mosquitoes. Examples include Zika, dengue, onchocerciasis, leishmaniasis. I would include malaria and tuberculosis on that list. There are some products being developed for those diseases, but too few given the enormous uh, suffering that they cause. Another example that for which the market fails to provide sufficient incentives is bioterror. The reason there's not much of an economic incentive is we will probably never need to use the products. I hope we won't. So examples of those include anthrax and smallpox. Also, the market doesn't provide sufficient incentives for the very rare diseases. The sort of diseases that maybe 10 to 100 Americans have each year. An example of that is DeGeorge syndrome. That example comes to mind because Duke University's own Dr. Louise Markert developed a product to treat patients with DeGeorge syndrome. Okay, so we have insufficient incentives for neglected diseases, bioterror, very rare diseases. We need more products, drugs, vaccines, and in the case of neglected diseases, pesticides that kill the mosquitoes that carry malaria. So the sort of pesticides that you might use on a bed net to protect someone from a mosquito-borne disease. How can we encourage new product development for these diseases? We can use push, or we can use pull, or both. These are complementary mechanisms. What do I mean by a push mechanism? Push mechanisms reduce the cost of product development. They're paid upfront, regardless of whether the product succeeds. The most familiar example of this would be, say, funding from the National Institutes of Health. So a grant from the NIH, a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But other push mechanisms include tax credits and certain public-private partnerships. Okay, so that's push, reducing costs, giving money upfront regardless of success. Pull mechanisms increase the returns conditional on success. With a pull mechanism, the funder only pays if the product succeeds. Examples of that include patents. Patents help increase your returns, help increase your profits by reducing your competition. But you only get paid if your product makes it to market and has some sales. Another example is an advanced market commitment where the funder, say the government, commits to buying a certain number of doses at a certain price until the amount of money is exhausted. An example of this is Operation Warp Speed. So under Operation Warp Speed, the US government committed to buying doses of COVID vaccines, committed to a price. Another example is a transferable exclusivity voucher. This is not to be confused with our own priority review voucher. There's two vouchers there. With a transferable exclusivity voucher, if you develop a product for a neglected disease, you would get longer exclusivity for a different product. That has not become law. That idea has been around a very long time. It's still considered from time to time by Congress. It's being considered right now by the European Union. That idea was around back in 2006 when we published our paper suggesting an alternative to an exclusivity voucher. We proposed a priority review voucher. If you develop a drug for neglected disease, you get to market faster for a different product. Let me give you some more details about priority review vouchers. Okay, this was our 2006 paper. and it became law in 2007. And so we're targeting the sort of viruses, bacteria, pests that cause these diseases. Also, more recently, in 2017, we published a paper that became law in December, targeting the mosquitoes and other pests that carry diseases with pesticides. I'll tell you a bit about both of these in a moment. First of all, let's start with that first column, the 2006 paper that became law in 2007. That's in both cases, it was published in Health Affairs. You can see that there was some time between the publications, a decade or so between them. You can see the Health Affairs formatting changed. But in the first one there, the yellow Health Affairs issue, you can see the lead article at the time was our paper, Developing Drugs for Developing Countries. This was a paper with two other Duke faculty, Jeff Moe, who was most recently at Duke Global Health, recently retired, and Henry Grabowski, also recently retired from the Department of Economics. So that was a team effort by three Duke faculty. The more recent paper, the 2017 paper, was also with Jeff Moe, and our other co-author on that was Nick Heyman from the Innovative Vector Control Consortium. Okay, so what's the idea of the priority review voucher? You develop that blue pill. That might be a pill for malaria, or onchocerciasis, or leishmaniasis, or Chagas, or dengue. And you get a voucher from the FDA for faster review of a different product, and you can sell that. So the key point here is there's two drugs for each voucher. The blue pill earns the voucher. An example of this would be a drug for onchocerciasis or river blindness. Actually, that's a real example. There was a voucher awarded for river blindness drug. And the second drug uses the voucher. An example of that would be a cholesterol drug. Again, that's a real example. A cholesterol drug has used the voucher to get to market faster. I want to be clear that priority review doesn't mean shortened clinical trials. You can see on the top row and the bottom row, the clinical trial length is the same. What's different is that in the bottom row, the FDA review time is shorter. So FDA reviews your paperwork in about 6 months instead of about 10 months. So your product gets to market about 4 months faster, starts making sales faster. The generic competition comes in most likely at the same time, but possibly even earlier. So there's two possibilities: that the end date for your sales before generic competition is the same, or possibly that moves forward as your review time moves forward. It depends on a variety of factors, including how long your clinical trials took. Be happy to answer questions in the chat if anybody wants the real deep details of this. Okay. A lot of diseases eligible for vouchers. In our 2007 paper, we proposed a list of diseases, and you can see those diseases on this list. If there's parentheses on this list, it means those diseases were added later. Congress expanded the priority review voucher program for just neglected tropical diseases to include rare pediatric diseases in 2012. And in 2016, Congress added medical countermeasures. So in 2012, Congress added diseases like DeGeorge syndrome, which I mentioned earlier, a very rare disease, children born without the thymus, so and will die without it. And so this biologic developed by a Duke doctor who received funding thanks to the priority review voucher program. In 2016, Congress added medical countermeasures, and that was to encourage products for diseases, threats such as anthrax and smallpox. Smallpox is a really interesting case. How do you develop a drug for a disease that's been eradicated? Well, one way is demonstrating that the product treats monkeypox. And indeed, that came in handy recently with the monkeypox outbreak that happened last year. Okay, There have been about 60 priority review vouchers awarded since the inception of the program. You can see that early on, there were very few vouchers awarded. Why is that? Well, most obviously, drug development takes a long time. Phase 1 trials take a couple of years, phase 2 trials take a couple of years, phase 3 trials take a couple of years, FDA review takes some time. There you've got 7 years piled up. But another reason is this is an idea that came out of some Duke faculty and was not initially very well known, and really especially gained traction after the first few vouchers were sold. That demonstrated to investors that there was that they could feel confident in getting some return. So an investor would then be more willing to give a scientist $20 million up front with the expectation that if that drug succeeded, there'd be a reward at the end. Okay, some concerns about the priority review voucher. The two major concerns are access and a declining price. Let's start with access. So the priority review voucher is awarded conditional on FDA approval of the drug. So if your malaria drug is approved by the FDA and is sufficiently novel, then you will receive a priority review voucher. There's no requirement that anybody actually accesses that drug, and that's potentially a problem. Fortunately, though, most of the drugs that have received vouchers have been reaching patients. Why is that? Well, for one thing, a lot of the people working on these diseases are humanitarians that want to make the world a better place. So, for example, Medicines Development for Global Health, a not-for-profit in Australia, received a voucher for a river blindness drug. Well, they're a not-for-profit whose mission is to get that drug to patients. And so they were already motivated to do this. Likewise, there are many big companies that are working on these diseases, in part because of the voucher, but also in part to make their employees proud. Many of our Fuqua students will go on to work for drug makers. They don't want to be embarrassed by the drug maker they work for. They want to be proud of that drug maker. And one way to make those employees proud is to work on these neglected diseases. So a lot of the big drug makers, Novartis, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, have received vouchers and are also quick to promote the good work that they're doing in the world and promoting it not so much to patients or doctors, but to their employees. So their employees are more likely to, so people are more likely to go work for them and stick around with them. One more reason why these drugs are tending to get to people is some of these drugs also had some upfront funding from the Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation, in their contracts, requires the drug makers to assure them that the products will reach people. Okay, so access is potentially a concern and has been a concern. I talked about several of the good examples. There's another example. Knight Therapeutics received a voucher for their leishmaniasis drug, and there were complaints in the global health community that that drug was not getting out to enough people. Why not? Well, Knight was a really small company at the time. They were transitioning to other priorities. They weren't willing, the little company wasn't willing to lose money getting this leishmaniasis drug out to patients. So there's certainly been some complaints about that leishmaniasis drug, but for the most part, that's the exception rather than the rule. Okay. I'm already seeing some action in the chat, and I will talk about in the Q&A. I'll talk about drug co-payments and accumulators. So part of my research is about drug development incentives, but part of my research is also about products getting out on the market and people reaching them, and this relates to our discussion of access. So more on drug co-pays in just a moment. Oh, and a question about accelerated. Okay, I need to turn away from the chat. I love the fact that these questions are coming in. I'll get to them in just a moment. I've got just a few more slides. Okay, first concern, access. Are people getting the drug? Second concern is voucher prices. So I showed you a moment ago that we've had a lot of vouchers awarded. In our original paper in 2007, we predicted that voucher prices would reach about 300 million, and they did. But our prediction was based on only neglected tropical diseases having vouchers. When Congress expanded the program, there were more vouchers and the price came down. It's funny because initially the prices went up. The first voucher sold for 67.5 million, then 125 million, then 245 million, then 350 million. Initially, they sold at low prices because people were just gaining confidence in the voucher program. You didn't want to be the fool that paid for 300 million for a voucher right away before the market really established itself. But the prices crept up over time. There was a silly analyst out there that drew a line through that and said that the prices are going to go even higher. We said, no, you just can't draw a line through these things. You need to base it on market fundamentals. So Stefan Renier and I wrote a paper saying price is going to probably come down. Why? Supply and demand. A lot of supply of vouchers out there, limited demand for there's a limited number of new products out there for cholesterol or diabetes or whatever that are willing to pay really high prices for just 4 months faster review. And the price did come down. Price has been about 100 million, although fortunately it's stabilized at about 100 million for many years. So you can see the price about 100 million. That's a good incentive. Some investors have told me that they need a voucher at 200 million, given that there's a lot of failure in drug development, given that there's a long lag before a product approval, given that clinical trials are expensive. They're looking for a $200 million voucher. We have some ideas for how to get that price up. One of those ideas is to introduce a priority review voucher in the European Union. And I was in Brussels last fall talking to some members of the European Parliament about that. So that might be coming. Members of the European Parliament are also thinking about exclusivity vouchers. Those are the vouchers that extend exclusivity. We'll see. So in the coming year should be interesting in the voucher debate. Regardless, 100 million is a useful incentive, especially when it's paired with other mechanisms, other push mechanisms, like NIH funding or a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or other pull mechanisms. As I said, there's a Duke connection here. The authors of the priority review voucher paper were Jeff Moe, Henry Grabowski, and me, all of Duke. Another Duke connection is that a Duke alumnus won a voucher and sold a voucher when he associated with a rare pediatric disease, and also associated with a rare pediatric disease, as I mentioned earlier. A Duke doctor received funding from a company because of the potential to receive a priority review voucher. Okay. And we'll put this website in the chat. This is my website, priorityreviewvoucher.org. Okay, let me go back to the chat. Okay, so when we were talking about access, one issue that Julia brought up is copay maximizers, copay accumulators. Okay, so copay maximizers and copay accumulators. Many Americans face a copay for their drugs. And pharmacy benefit managers and insurers and employers often put this cost sharing in place. This cost sharing can be a problem for the patient. It can also be a problem for the drug maker. And the drug maker often facilitates access by giving a coupon for that copay. So for an expensive specialty drug, you might have a copay, say, of $100 for a month. The drug maker might make that go away with a copay, with a coupon. Insurers don't like that. Insurers don't want the drug manufacturer to pay for that. Insurers want the patient to have some skin in the game so that the patient thinks twice about that expensive drug. Maybe there's a cheaper drug the patient could take instead. Maybe a 5-year-old or 10-year-old drug, maybe something that's even available as a generic rather than the latest and greatest drug. So insurers don't like manufacturers paying for drug copays. And so insurers have tried to push back against this to the extent that they could observe that coupon. They have said that doesn't count, that doesn't count against your deductible, or that doesn't count as part of your payment. So this is part of an ongoing fight between insurers and drug makers. The drug makers argue that they're helping the patient. They're increasing access to the product. The insurers, employers, pharmacy benefit managers argue that the drug maker is undermining an important mechanism for giving patients skin in the game. So, copay maximizers, copay accumulators have been something insurers have been using to push back against this. Another way they've pushed back against this is just leaving expensive drugs off formulary. So, pharmacy benefit managers have been more and more willing to say no to patients. No, you can't have this expensive drug. This drug is just as good, and we can get it cheaper. We've negotiated bigger rebates, so you just can't have this drug. In the past, this drug would have been a high copay, but then drug makers were paying that copay. And so now many PBMs just say, you can't have it. You can only have this drug. Thanks for your great question, Julia. Ryan S. The accelerated approval program for more rare diseases. That's a great question from Ryan. Yeah. So I'm talking today about priority review, which is the FDA looking at your paperwork in 6 months instead of 10 months. There's also an accelerated approval program. Those sound alike. FDA has a priority review program and an accelerated program. Priority and accelerated sound the same. They're not. Priority review means the FDA reviews your paperwork in about 6 months instead of 10. Accelerated means your drug is approved based on surrogate endpoints. So surrogate endpoints, so for example, a surrogate endpoint might be a reduction in plaque in the brain, whereas a clinical endpoint would be improved cognition. So for Alzheimer's disease, do we want a drug that demonstrates reduced plaque or a drug that demonstrates improved cognition? For cholesterol drugs, for statins or the PCSK9 inhibitors, do we want a drug that lowers the bad cholesterol or a drug that extends life? Well, the advantage of the surrogate endpoint, the plaque, the lowering the bad cholesterol, is that the drug can get to market sooner. Why do we want the drug to get to market sooner? So that patients can benefit faster. Both priority and accelerated were created, I believe, around 1992, early 1990s, after the HIV/AIDS epidemic had taken off. HIV/AIDS advocates said to Congress, FDA is slow and people are dying here. Give us drugs faster. FDA should work faster, priority review. You should approve drugs based on surrogate endpoints so that people can start benefiting from the drugs sooner. Now, that was a long preface to Ryan's question, which is, would it be a good idea to expand the accelerated approval program? Should FDA approve more drugs based on surrogate endpoints? You haven't done ultimately what we want you to do with the drug, say extending life, but you've shown that your drug can reduce plaque or reduce bad cholesterol or shrink a tumor, and we'll settle for that in the short run. Now, in the long run, FDA is going to want you to show long-run trials showing the improvement in cognition or the improvement in survival. But in the short run, I think it makes a lot of sense. Look, this is what you have to do for Alzheimer's disease, at least in the short run, because this disease progresses so slowly. The clinical trials that have to go on for decades. I think it makes a lot of sense to use surrogate endpoints up front. However, you do need to hold the drug maker accountable for the follow-up trials against the clinical endpoints. In general, I'm an economist, I'm a free market type. So yes, I would be in favor of more people having access to more medicines. Conditional on doing follow-up trials, and perhaps also conditional on, and also perhaps paying lower prices. If there's less evidence that the drug works at this stage, there's an argument to be made for a lower price at this stage. Of course, then if the evidence comes in as strong, I would want the price to increase. Increasing prices a lot can be hard politically, but I'd want that price to go up when the evidence comes in. I think accelerated approval is fascinating. In fact, a couple of my colleagues and I are doing some early stage research on a paper about FDA's accelerated approval process. It's still early stage, but it's a cool paper. and it's being written by people across 3 different academic areas at Fuqua. So it's interdisciplinary in some sense, and so watch for that paper in 2024. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Let's see the next question. Yeah. Okay. Question from Stephanie. Hello, Stephanie. Uh, recent participant in our academic programs. About the transferable exclusivity program. Okay, what is this? So, under the priority review voucher program, you do a good deed, you get faster FDA review. Under the exclusivity voucher program, you do a good deed and you get a longer exclusivity for a different drug. And that's worth real money. I talked about the priority review voucher being worth $100 million, $300 million. An exclusivity voucher, so an extra 6 months for a blockbuster drug like Humira, a blockbuster drug making $10 billion a year, extra 6 months of that might be worth $5 billion. That's real money. So if you really care about these diseases, and you should, these diseases cause enormous suffering. Malaria and tuberculosis are causing COVID-19 level suffering. So these are awful diseases. We need a powerful incentive. So there's an argument for an exclusivity voucher. The problem with an exclusivity voucher is it means people paying higher prices for longer. It means that it takes longer for people to get access to a generic drug that might save them a lot of money. It's not obvious that the generics for Humira will save a lot of money, at least not right away. So maybe $5 billion was an exaggeration, but you can imagine these exclusivity vouchers being worth more than $1 billion. The Europeans are talking about the potential for an exclusivity voucher, and I think they're especially interested in antimicrobials. There's a lot of concern about resistance to bacterial resistance to existing products. So it's a powerful incentive. It's real money, and we do need powerful incentives. However, it comes at the expense of delayed access to generics. If you go to my research webpage, you can see a couple of articles I wrote about exclusivity vouchers last year. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually came to me. Someone from the foundation came to me and asked me to write a paper about exclusivity vouchers because drug makers are still interested in those for obvious reasons. And the Gates Foundation is eager to make a difference for these diseases. So that idea has been around since before the priority review voucher. And it hasn't been politically feasible yet, but things could change. So probably won't happen because it's politically quite challenging, but it would be a powerful incentive. In our paper, we argued that if enough people are insured, and they are presumably in the European Union, and more Americans are insured as Medicaid expands, for example, North Carolina just expanded Medicaid, then delaying generics is not horrible if someone else is helping to pay your bills. It's not so much of a burden for that sick patient. I'm running out of time. Do I have one more minute? I think I don't. So forgive me. I love these questions. But we're about up against the hour, and so I need to wrap. Okay. So 3 quick announcements before we go. First, in case you're curious about where I am, yes, I am in a hotel room. Summer is conference season for academics, and I'm on the road. I just finished a health economics conference yesterday. Second, it seems that many of you are interested in issues beyond neglected diseases. I gave a Fuqua Forum talk about trends in the pharmaceutical industry last month. There should be a recording up that for my Fuqua Forum soon. They're just adding closed captioning. And finally, this is part of the LinkedIn Live series from Fuqua. You can follow Fuqua on LinkedIn for events like this. My colleague John Graham will be talking about the Chief Financial Officer Survey on July 12th. John, an excellent academic, also an excellent basketball player. I hope you can join John. So thanks so much for being with me today. Really enjoyed this discussion, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.